Our third segment is Evaluation Basics. This segment, we review common causes and corrections of airfield marking failures. This includes issues and solutions for both paint and glass beads. Let's drop in.
So there's really three primary evaluation basics. One is you're going to be looking at retro failure, you're going to look at retro variance, and then we're going to look at methods of correction. So we will get started with Mike. Why don't you talk about evaluating for retroreflectivity failure causes?
Sure, thanks, Craig. And we've touched on a couple of things. We kind of started scratching the surface on a couple of these causes of failure. What I see typically is, again, glass bead embedment and glass bead distribution, resulting in the failure for, at least for visibility concerns. The other thing that is that can directly cause either one of those things is the uniform thickness of the material that you're applying. 99% of the time, I'm looking at waterborne paint. So if you are spraying maybe a 6-inch line or 12-inch line, one gun, and it's not perfectly even, that will absolutely affect some of your not only your retro levels, but your uniformity as well, or the lateral deviation, we sometimes call it. As far as the marking, coating, and the contaminants on the marking, those can go kind of together. Certainly, the type and color can be affected. The color can be affected by just wear, natural wear from UV. But again, the distribution of how uniformly you apply it, how thick it is, those things can absolutely have an impact, both positively and negatively, on retro values. And then contaminants on the marking. We just went out and did this was a couple days ago, actually. We did a test for Kentucky DOT at one of their airports that had algae growing from edge to edge of its runway, and it was essentially obscuring all of its white markings. We went out there, we did a mobile assessment of all of those markings before, and then we had a contractor come in, do some water blasting with a light cleaning solution. We measured them after we increased the retro by 50%. So, you know,
Wow.
let's say you were at 100 millicandelas, we were then closer to 150 millicandelas after just cleaning, not repainting, just cleaning. So the contaminants on a marking can absolutely affect retro values.
Great. Again, I see this as almost a checklist for you. You know, okay, I've got my retro failed. What's the reason? Okay, so it's going to be one of these three things most likely. It's either going to be the beads, it's going to be the coating, the paint itself, or it's going to be contaminants, as you were talking about. I want to focus on paint distribution, kind of as Mike did. It's extremely important that your lateral thickness is consistent as consistent as possible, especially with thinner coatings like type 2 waterborne paints. I often see folks use architectural airless spray tips. That's generally a black tip, depending on which machine you're using and what brand tips. And these tips are designed to feather the edges. And what happens is, so they're architectural, so they're really kind of designed to spray, let's just say a vertical wall or something. So you spray across and it overlaps, and the edges overlap back and forth, so you don't have these runs. The problem is if you use these for pavement markings, you're going to have a thick center and lighter edges. And we talked about this earlier. I mentioned it in the bead part. What's happening is that the edges, the outer edge of those lines, are oftentimes the paint's not thick enough in order to retain those beads properly, or to get the embedment for proper retroreflectivity. So that's something that you really have to watch for. All right, let's now move to retro variance causes. And basically, there's really two reasons that you're going to have this retrovariance. Either it's poor bead distribution or overlapping, or it's poor paint distribution or overlapping. We see this a lot on the larger airfield markings. Mike and I have a little differing opinions on how to deal with it. Excuse me. But I will say that Mike has a lot more experience on these wider markings than I do. Usually in a roadway situation, you can we can make a single pass with one gun, up to about 24 inches. So we rarely have to go over and gang these guns for a roadway marking. But the problem that you see normally is that the beads are not being evenly distributed, or the paint's not evenly distributed, which can cause variance in bead embedment. And you could have a 3-foot line that looks like two 12-inch lines. So I think that can be confusing to to the airfield users. So Mike, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is you've hit it pretty well. Very often it's the paint distribution and or the bead distribution. The overlaps are a real thing when you're especially like you said, when you're dealing with wider markings. Again, my ideal is, if it were my airport and I had a spec truck to paint my runway markings, I want a truck with 6 paint guns and 6 bead dispensers, basically one and one for each 6-inch line. And so you are required to slightly overlap those paint guns. So essentially on a 6-gun setup, you would have 5 individual overlaps in between each one of the guns. I think that's optimal, but it does create some issues. If you don't have an overlap, you have a gap, and that is so the overlap is really the lesser of two evils. However, when you have that overlap, particularly when you're using, let's say, you've got an airless system and you're using switch tips, you've got, let's say, some Graco tips. Those, what you want to use, what I advise you use is those yellow or gold LL or line laser pavement marking tips. And those are what have been designed to paint markings as uniformly as possible for pavement marking. It is not an architectural tip. Like Greg mentioned, those black tips are not good for airfield markings. Unless, Greg, I know you've got an opinion on this. You want to share that one?
Yeah, so the one of the fixes that we've toyed with is where we'll have the inner tips of a gang of guns would be these architectural tips because they're designed to overlap, and then the edge ones, the edge guns, actually have the line. The pavement marking tips, which you identified as a yellow tip, which is correct in the Graco, and I think it might be red on Titan. And those, and what you do is what that does is that creates a more even overlapping. The problem with the yellow tips is that they are the same thickness all the way across. And so therefore, if you overlap them, then you will have a double thickness every time those lines come together. With the black tips in the center, remember in the center, not on the edges, but with the black tips or the architectural tips in the center, when they overlap, hopefully, the concept is, if they're set up just right, that you'll have the same more even thickness across the system. And really kind of going back to, you have the paint distribution, but then of course you have the bead distribution, which can be, depending on what kind of system they're using. But most of the time what we found is that it ultimately comes down to the paint thickness, because again, you have beads that, let's say they're in a double thickness, so they're embedded deeper. So that reduces their reflectivity, and then you have them that's in the normal area where it's single thickness, and so they're brighter, so you get that duller, brighter across the line. But yeah, but I think you, Mike, you've had some success with using If I had a choice of my primary fix would be the architectural tips in the middle and the line striping tips on the edge. But if I didn't do that, I would eliminate the architectural tips altogether and just do the line marking material or stripes. Well, try that, tips across the entire system. So that's my thought on it. Mike, if you want to follow up on that.
Yeah, and I think I have seen that strategy work. I was working with a contractor doing quality control for a consultant engineer on a new project. This guy had a 6-gun setup, painting with black tips all the way across, and he was painting 6 feet wide in one pass, which is pretty much the widest I've ever seen. When he told me what he was going to do, I tried not to laugh and said, okay, well, this is going to be a really short calibration, and we're going to switch into some pavement marking tips, and I'm going to, ruin this guy's day. But I'm a kind of results-oriented guy, and I don't really pay attention to means and methods. He produced a pretty awesome 6-inch or 6-foot line in a single pass with his truck. It was pretty amazing. So it definitely can be done. The last thing I'll say about this, irrespective of how wide you're painting or how many guns, I really don't care. It really all comes back down to quality control. Somebody has to be monitoring the material distribution. I don't know how many times I've trained an inspector or coached up an inspector, and they said, hey, we did the calibration and everything was good, and then we went out at night and it looked all streaky. What am I doing wrong? It's like, well, once you do the calibration, that's kind of step one. Then you got to do this control strip and make sure everything is uniform. It doesn't happen by chance. You really have to have a lot of intent and attention to detail to get it right and to get it uniform.
Yeah, once it's done, it's a little late, and it's hard to go back over those markings and correct them. It's not impossible at all, but it stinks to have to go back out there and do it. So definitely monitoring it, like you're saying, while you're doing is super important, and making sure you're doing it right. I think, Mike, you guys have in your symposium, you actually go over how to basically calibrate the bead drop and so forth. Is that correct?
Yeah, our Airfield Marking Symposium, which is essentially a public training on best practices of airfield markings. One of the things we do, we teach you the calibration process in class, and then we go out on the airfield and demonstrate that so you can see. And it's a pretty simple science. This is not rocket science, but there is a science to it, and it's fairly simple, fairly straightforward process. But somebody has to be doing it to make sure, again, attention to detail. Somebody has to be doing that, not only for contractors, but in-house crews as well.
Great. All right. Very good. All right. Now let's move on to the methods of correction. So typically you're going to have one of two problems. Either you're going to have, because that's what's in the specs, right? You're either going to have a deviation of retroreflectivity that falls, that goes above that 30%, or you're going to have a retroreflectivity problem, which is going to cause that marking that's when that marking is below the minimum retroreflectivity. So there are basically a few methods in which we can correct that. And I'll let you start us out there, Mike.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so really, when we're doing assessments, our goal for an airport is to tell you what you don't have to paint. We don't have any ties to any contracting side or business, so we get to be independent and unbiased, and we come in and we're really trying to reduce the amount of markings you have to paint. We want to see airports cleaning rather than repainting, and definitely rather than removing and repainting. That's where the cost gets exponentially higher, as you can see from this graph. I will say that it comes with the cleaning comes with a big caveat that it has to be installed well initially in order to even have a chance to clean it. If it's not installed well, let's say you have non-uniform markings or poor embedment, those beads are sitting high in the paint. Cleaning with maybe a pressure washer, but if you have, let's say, an ultra high pressure water blaster or a high pressure water blaster, something like that can actually take those beads completely out of the paint, and now you are into repainting, which is not what we're looking for. So I just wanted to quick digress. One of the things that we didn't mention with the new standard for minimum levels of reflectivity was a footnote that is in that, essentially FAA's standard for remarking when you're less than 100 millicandelas on white, 75 on yellow, 10 on red. They have a little footnote that says, prior to remarking, determine if removal of contaminants on the markings will restore retroreflectance. And that is a really good idea. That's very smart that the FAA included that. The idea is they're saying, hey, before you just go paint on top of whatever's out there, see if you can clean it first. Just like that airport in Kentucky I mentioned a couple of days ago, they found out that there's markings, there's actual paint under all of this algae. We just had to clean it and we're good to go.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's something that we should learn in the roadway industry as well. A lot of times you can go out there and clean the lines or clean the signs, and you'll find that that you can beef that or push that retroreflectivity back up just by, remember, it's light hitting glass and reflecting back. If there's something interfering with that, whether it be algae or anything else, and that light can't get through the glass to begin with, and then come back through the glass, it's going to dramatically decrease the retroreflectivity. I can't really add much more to this. It's just basically, the more you have to do, the more it's going to cost. Catching the problem early is important, and to understand, kind of as Mike said, many times I've seen this knee-jerk reaction is, let's just paint over the top the defect. And that rarely ends well, especially if you have a peeling problem, or even if you have, for instance, mold, mildew, that kind of thing, because a lot of times that paint will stick to the mold and the mildew. As I said earlier, it'll stick to whatever it's sticking to. But if that's not sticking to what's under it, you're going to have problems, and you're going to have some peeling and so forth as well. I definitely would agree. Start with the idea of cleaning. I sell paint. And love to sell more paint, but in the end, it's about keeping that airport safe and doing it in an economic way, or economical way. And definitely, if you can clean first, repaint. But then, of course, if you repaint, eventually you'll get to the point where you're going to have to remove and repaint.
Thank you for joining us for our segmented video series on the Airfield Marking Assessment Quick Guide. And a special thank you to the Sightline team, who without their experience and expertise, we could not have produced such an informative presentation. Get more information on this series, case studies, tools, equipment, and services for airfield marking assessments at pppcatalog.com/AFM. Again, that's pppcatalog.com/AFM, as in airfield markings. Thank you. Have a great day.